All right. Well, thank you very much, and thanks for having me here. And I will try to keep you awake here in the post-lunch session, which I know can be a bit of a challenge. So, I was speaking in front of the legislature a few months ago about a mileage-based user fee program, also called a road usage charge, also called a vehicle miles traveled fee, because we really don't know what to call it. We're very confused. And basically laying out some guidelines. And I'm going to go through that. I'm going to go through the history. There's a couple of different proposals, obviously different departments in Michigan. The Michigan Department of Transportation has, they have some ideas. The legislators have other ideas. County Road Association has some ideas, trying to get everyone on the same page as we go forward. So, all right. So a brief presentation summary, and I should add, I expect this presentation will take probably about 35 minutes. My goal is to allow quite a bit of time at the end for questions if you have any, and so I'm going to be deliberate here, but also move through it somewhat quickly. So I want to discuss why an alternative revenue source is needed. Right now, the fuel tax provides more of the transportation funding than any other source, but that is not sustainable. I'm going to talk about some of the other options. I'm going to discuss concerns with the mileage-based user fee that we hear about why it might be a problem for certain folks, what we think would be best for a state pilot, talk a little bit about what Michigan has done so far and what they've learned, and also how, in our minds, would be the most effective way to conduct a state pilot. So the fuel tax, and I have my sort of montage of aging rockers on the bottom here. The fuel tax has been the largest funding mechanism for Michigan's highways, and Michigan actually gets its funding from a variety of sources, but the fuel tax is providing the most of it, a leading amount. And it's been effective not just here in Michigan, but throughout the country for 100 years. And the problem is, because of the increase in electric vehicles, hybrid vehicles, and improving fuel efficiency of conventional vehicles, it is no longer sustainable going forward. It's not actually been sustainable for the last 10 years, and it's really getting worse. And I want to highlight the conventional vehicles, because I go to a lot of places and they're like, well, let's just, stick on a surcharge of $300 for electric vehicles and we're going to solve the problem. And the answer is that's really not going to solve the problem. Because right now, the largest problem is conventional vehicles, and that's because that's what most people own. And when you purchase a new Ford F-150, when you purchase a new Toyota Camry, it is often 4 or 5 miles per gallon more fuel efficient than the one you previously had. And that is a big drop-off. And, electric vehicles, they are coming, but they are coming slowly, and they are still a small percentage of the fleet, particularly in Michigan, and that's also true of hybrids. And so the reason I use these rock stars is because I like to call the fuel tax a rock star on its farewell tour. It's been around for a while, been sustainable for a while, living on borrowed time, not going to be here for much longer. Well, not going to be touring for much longer. It won't be too morbid. And overall, the fuel tax has lost about 50% of its purchasing power over the last 30 years. So just to put a number on what the difference is. And that's why we need a new long-term funding source. So there's a lot of different funding options, and a group called the American Association of State Highway and Transportation Officials, which is basically a Department of Transportation trade group, has done several studies looking at them, and they've all got pluses and minuses. So what are some of the most promising here in Michigan? So often things are funded out of the general fund. Had discussions, presentation earlier about transit and how that might get funded. The challenge with highways and the general fund is that it's not reliable, it's not dedicated, and it has to compete against other priorities. And usually transportation does not win versus those other priorities. Sales tax, same thing, competing with other priorities. Also, when there's an economic recession, like we had the Great Recession, sales tax revenue declines significantly, and that can be a real problem if you're bonding against future revenue, which is how most roadway improvements happen. Property taxes, they would need to be extremely high to effectively pay for roads, and it's not something that's currently done. And then folks have looked at, well, how about a tire tax? How about a weight distance fee, which is actually charged in Oregon for trucks? I actually have had some legislators saying, can't we just have Ohio pay for it? And I said, well, I don't think they'd be a fan of that. It's not an easy problem to solve. Tolling is another promising option. Obviously, there's been some studies that have looked at tolling, including of interstates and other freeways, and we actually think with the mileage-based user fee, those go hand in hand very well. But you can't toll your neighborhood streets, and there's also some federal prohibitions that makes tolling a little bit tricky. So tolling part of the solution, but not the whole solution. So that's why we think mileage-based user fees are a promising option. I would go so far as to say the most promising option. As I mentioned, also road usage charge, road charge, vehicle miles traveled fee, these are all, some of it's geographic, some of it's branding, acronyms of positives and negatives. Again, they would be for all vehicles, not just electric and hybrid. And as the name indicates, it is charged per mile. It is a mileage-based user fee. So unlike the gas tax, which is charged based on the fuel efficiency of your vehicle, if you have a really fuel-efficient vehicle, you win. If you don't, you lose. This is equal for all people. And typically the rate, based on what Michigan's transportation funding is right now, would be between about 2 and 2.5 cents per mile. That's state, that does not include federal. Heavy-duty trucks, tractor trailers, would pay a higher rate, most likely. This is not set in stone, but most likely about 4 times higher, since they wear out highways more than automobiles, and they wear out highways more than 100 times more than automobiles. So 4 times is actually still a very good deal for them, but obviously they transport important freight that we need throughout, throughout the country, throughout the state, so it's important. That 4 times rate is pretty typical for what you see in other states for toll roads and turnpikes. So a question I get asked a lot is, well, this is an interesting idea, but you're from a think tank, and what do you know? Have other states actually studied this? And the answer is yes. A number of other states have. There's actually been 2 national commissions, as you can see, quite a few years ago, that studied different transportation options. They were some of the ones that looked at this whole menu of choices, and they recommended a mileage-based user fees as a way forward. There's actually been more than 30 states, some as part of multi-state coalitions, that have conducted pilots. 2 of those coalitions, the Eastern Transportation Coalition and Ruck America, have done some interstate work, some trucking work. And then there's now 5 states that have permanent programs, and we're going to get into those a little bit in a few minutes. So what exactly have some of these other states studied? Because it's important to learn from what some of these places have done. We don't want to duplicate this. We don't want to create the wheel again. And so Virginia looked specifically at communications, at the option of choice. In other words, what different types of collection options could you have, things such as an odometer reading, a non-GPS based system. They also looked at regional cooperation, since Northern Virginia is obviously part of the D.C. region. They've got D.C., Maryland, West Virginia all in there, and they did theirs back in 2019 and 2020. They had 2 pilots. They now have a permanent program, which I'm going to talk about in a little while. Oregon was one of the earlier adopters of a permanent program. They really focused heavily on privacy. They actually worked with the ACLU, which had some privacy concerns, to craft their legislation. They also looked at communications. They looked at urban-rural, since that's often a big concern about will rural people pay more, and I'll get to that in a little while as well. And they also now have a permanent program. So it's 2 of the states with a permanent program. Ohio, neighbor to the south, a bit of a rival in some areas I know, is focused right now on education and outreach. They are laser focused on education and outreach for their program, and that is an ongoing pilot that they're doing right now. Pennsylvania has looked at communications and choice, also some regional cooperation in the Northeast. They've had some political challenges, shall I say, and so their current program is paused, but they're looking to restart that. Oklahoma is an interesting state. Because they have a lot of Native American tribal governments, they have to look at how they're going to go ahead and solve that challenge, how they divvy up the revenue. They have some current Supreme Court rulings that affect how they can collect revenue, and so that program is complete, but they're doing evaluation right now. California is doing their 7th, and they tell me final pilot, looking at communications choice. and also some regional cooperation. California likes to do things multiple times. I'm not necessarily sure I recommend you follow their method, but anyway, they are on the way. Georgia just completed a pilot looking at communications. They are really looking at political feasibility, which I think is very wise, and they are planning a second pilot. And then finally, Minnesota started early on, very early, 2007 to 2012, and they right now are in the legislature deciding how they want to move forward with a permanent program. So those are the pilots, a lot of detail there, and I give that just to show you there's a lot of different things to look at. I now have another bit of an eye chart slide talking about some permanent programs. And I want to start with Virginia, which has what's called mileage choice. And so the Virginia program is the most successful by number of people enrolled. They have more than 20,000 folks enrolled. They have way more than 20,000. They probably have close to 40,000 now. That's the most up-to-date number I could get. They have an odometer reading, a non-GPS enabled, and a GPS enabled, and I'll get into that a little bit more a little bit later. They work with a private account manager, which we found to be a good practice. Oftentimes, folks have concerns about governments having access to their data. Contracting with a private account manager seems to decrease that. It also, since this is a new technology, most DOTs don't have a lot of experience actually doing this, or in fact have the staff that could do this, and so working with an account manager that can help. Their program is open to vehicles that get 26 miles per gallon or better. And one of the very clever things they did is they set the rate at 95% of the rate of what folks would pay with the fuel tax. So if you enrolled in a mileage-based user fee, you would actually see a very, very small savings to try to encourage people, give them a carrot to move over. Oregon also has a program. Theirs has not been as successful with fewer than 1,000 vehicles signed up. They have the same three options, same private account manager. They are open to all vehicles regardless of fuel efficiency, and they are looking at ways to make it mandatory, maybe with a few more carrots the way Virginia did it. Utah has taken a slightly different approach. They are right now only looking at electric vehicles, and that's because they've had some challenges with collection costs, which we'll get to in a minute. Hawaii has a brand new program that's starting with electric vehicles, but is expanding to all vehicles by 2032, and they have basically this slow phase-in that they think is going to help them with administrative costs. And then finally, Vermont has put in a fee right now for electric vehicles, and also has plans to expand it over time. So there's a lot of information on those two slides. I just want to give an overview of what some of these states are doing, and we'll sort of address some of these issues that I lightly touched on in the next few slides. So let's talk a bit about the common concerns or the reasons, and some of which you can see with the pilots tried to address the common concern. One of them, not surprisingly, is privacy. And people tell me a mileage-based user fee can be used to monitor my location. I have actually had several reporters tell me, this is a confession they have told me, that they are worried that with this system that their wife would find out that they are cheating with their mistress. And I have said to them, okay, that seems like another problem that you need to be. But in fact, that is the good news for them. I guess it's good news for them. I don't know. Is that MBUFs, the way they use GPS, it is a one-way collection device. And so you would need a second system to actually identify exactly where and when that person is in a specific location. And so this sort of real-time tracking is not something that can actually happen right now with the systems that are being used today. Another concern we have is rural residents. Rural folks believe that they'll pay more because they drive more, which is, I can understand that logic. But what we found is because overall, rural residents tend to have vehicles that are less fuel efficient, I want to say that correctly, they actually wind up paying less than they would now. They wind up with a lower percentage of the overall cost, a smaller burden, because overall, not in all cases, but overall, the vehicles that rural folks drive tend to be more pickup trucks, less fuel efficient. And the other issue we get, or another issue we get, I should say, is equity. It's unfair to low-income residents with older vehicles. And I guess I would point out that it is much better for those folks than the gas tax, because right now under the gas tax, if you have an older vehicle, you're the one that's really paying, whereas here you're actually paying a more proportional share. A couple others we have, double taxation. My group works with a lot of folks on the right. It's obviously an understandable concern. And we are always saying, and this is the way that every state that I know is approaching it right now, a mileage-based user fee is a replacement and not a supplement. So we're not going to add something on, we're going to take it out, and in the pilots that we've seen, and a pilot that I recommend Michigan do, it would be, a mileage-based user fee would be, the fuel tax, excuse me, would be refunded to participants, or it would be a simulation. There would be no double taxation. And then the cost of collection. And this is one that is still a little challenging. Initially, the costs of collection are higher than the fuel tax. Right now, fuel tax cost of collection, 3-4% when you can consider evasion, whereas mileage-based user fee is between 10 and 20%. That's going to go down with scale. That's going to go down with more competition in account managers. But at least initially, that's something that is going to be a little higher. So there's a lot of questions that a state pilot would answer, and some of them I just addressed. And one of the things I want to point out is when I met with legislators, I had some legislators, and I will say this, when I met with the department, I don't think this will get me in trouble, Department of Transportation, I had some folks that said, well, forget a pilot. We know this is the thing. Let's just go to this. Let's not waste our time with a pilot. Okay, so every state is different. I'm fortunate enough to work in many different states, and the needs in Michigan are different, and how things might work in the Upper Peninsula are different than they work in the Lower Peninsula. So it's really important to test it in Michigan. And the one example I give is Hawaii. Rental cars are a big deal. They had to figure out how they're going to integrate rental cars into their system. I think it's important to show folks that it works in reality, to show the options, to show basically all of the things that I talked about that are not just theoretical or something that we came up with in a report, but that you can experience. One of the things we found is that support for this concept initially is maybe not real high because it sounds a little scary and is it really going to work? What really increases support is when people experience it. When they go through the pilot, when they live it, when they see that it's non-invasive too, but non-invasive, that it's something that is relatively simple and easy to do. And you see support going from 40% to 80%. It's really quite amazing. And so that alone is a reason. Another thing in Michigan is some of the multi-state travel, not as much in other states, but the role that Ontario, the role that Ohio and Indiana, even to a lesser extent Wisconsin, can be important. And then also transitioning from a pilot to permanent program. Some states have really looked at that. Other states have not studied it as much. I think it can be very helpful going forward. So the responses to a mileage-based user fee are all over the map. We have some people, I met with the state representative, I'm not going to say who it was, and I will say that this person was so excited with this concept, she started dancing in the meeting. That is not a typical reaction I get in transportation. In fact, that is not a reaction I've ever gotten in transportation before. Or I get the people who are, cheating on their wives who are not so happy with the concept. So anyway, I like to say, you're probably, it's somewhere in one of these four pictures at the bottom. If you think that these are the best things that you've ever heard of, and it was thought up by a bunch of geniuses, you should support a pilot because it's going to prove your idea. Whereas if you think this is a terrible idea and it was thought up by idiots who don't know what they're talking about, you should also support this pilot because it's going to prove that you were right. I want to talk a little bit about Michigan's previous work because Michigan has done a sort of mileage-based user fee pilot before. It was a bus mobility wallet pilot, and they've actually concluded it. I think they've concluded it now. May still be going on. The first step was a statistically representative statewide survey testing knowledge, mileage-based user fee, or RUC knowledge and acceptance. And you could actually do this online, and I saw it, and I thought it was a very good study. And as of February, which is the last time I checked, there was a total of 19,000 validated responses, which is a pretty good, rate, assuming that it's representative. And they asked about transportation methods, thoughts on mileage-based user fees. They had a little video that explained it. They had questions on feasibility. They got some geographic data to make sure it was representative. And I thought it was actually a very good start to this next pilot that I'm going to talk about, because it gave a lot of good information to folks and also got a lot of good information from folks about sort of what this baseline knowledge is. Now, the second step of this is mobility as a wallet simulation, which is, not to go into too much detail, but it was designed for transit users in Detroit and Grand Rapids to see sort of how a mileage-based user fee would affect transit. Would they take the buses more than they already do? Which is interesting, but it's not, one, it's obviously just limited to those two areas. Two, it's not really solving the larger problem of revenue. But I still think that public opinion survey can be quite helpful. So let's talk about the pilot application, and I'm going to try to sort this out, because this is a little complicated. Honestly, there's no other way to do it. In 2023, so last year, the Michigan legislature passed a bill to require the Department of Transportation to conduct a pilot. It's very simple. I provided advice on that bill. When the 2024 legislative session began earlier this year, there was, I would say, some confusion as to whether the department had started doing a pilot or not doing a pilot. And the communication between the legislature and the department was not ideal. Let's put it that way. As a result, the legislature added budget language into the 2024 budget that we heard they're working on right now, requiring a pilot. And as state of, full honesty, we assisted in that budget language as well. Okay. Several months ago, the department announced that it was, in fact, working on a pilot under the 2023 bill. And last month, it submitted this request to the Federal Highway Administration for funding. The federal government can provide up to 80% of the total funds for a pilot, which is good. The problem is the process of funding can take up to 2 years. So you apply in May, it might be May of 2026 before you hear. That is not a fast time frame, at least in my ideal world. It may be sooner than that. I hope it's sooner than that. And so as a result, the legislature decided to remove the language for another pilot from this year's budget and use that funding somewhere else. Now, we're going to get back to that. The MDOT pilot was a pretty standard application, examining rural and urban challenges, choices of collection options, some public sentiment as well. I will be blunt to this group and say it could have been better. It's not bad. It could have been better. We have 30 places who have done this now, okay? I think if they had done a little bit more with cost of collection and a partnership with the County Road Association, who, as I know everyone in this room knows, owns a lot of the roads in Michigan, that would have been a little bit more attractive, simply because the Federal Highway Administration is looking for two things. They're looking for new and innovative, because they don't want to fund things that have already been funded in the past. That makes sense. And they're looking for partnerships, especially with county and local governments, because that's a priority of this administration. And as I mentioned, the federal funding provides up to 80% of the cost, but these are very competitive grants. So it is very possible that the department will only get, a smaller percentage. I don't know. I'm not going to hesitate. I'm not going to guess. There's a lot of factors that play here, including political. It could be 40%. Now, the good news on that bad news, as I will say it, is that in our conversations with the legislature, they are ready for a supplemental budget request to fill in the gap, should that be needed, to which I think there is a decent chance that it is. Another option would be to scale back the size of the pilot. I don't think that would be a good idea. The pilots that we've seen that have fewer than, say, about 5,000 participants are not super representative, especially in a state like Michigan that's got a lot of diversity in terms of urban, rural, and geographic, but that's another option. So the other thing that we are working with the department on right now is, given the existing pilot and what they've applied for, and once you submit an application to the Federal Highway Administration, you can't then say, well, we'd actually like to do it a little differently. I mean, there's a little bit of wiggle room, but you can't do that. So given the existing language, there's a few things we are recommending that we think would improve it. One is to add a legislative steering committee. We have found that in states that have legislative steering committees, Washington State was a really good example, the pilots just went better. And it just makes sense to have the folks who are going to be voting on your program an active part of your pilot, because you want to get their buy-in. They're going to, speak with their representatives and bring their concerns. It's just, it's just a good idea. And obviously, you'd have folks from the department. You'd have folks that are concerned about privacy. You'd have folks that are concerned about, rural buy-in. Another thing would be moving up the timeline. Currently, the department is waiting to start the legislative planning until they get the grant. I think they could actually start it somewhat in anticipation, since regardless of whether they get the pilot or not, whether they get the grant or not, there's going to be some type of pilot. So some of the planning processes are for federal only. I understand that. Some of them could happen. Public outreach, I think this is really important. One of the problems we've seen in some of the pilots across the country is that the public doesn't know that they're happening, or it's just targeted at a few people. And so making sure that as many folks in the state are aware of it is really important. I mentioned earlier how privacy, and I didn't mention as much how the security aspects need to be detailed. I think these are, in my opinion, a little vague, and I'd like to see a little bit more work on these issues. And then I know I mentioned the cost of collection. The cost of collection is by far the biggest challenge right now with the program. Some of it is a good negotiation with a private vendor. Some of it is scale. Some of it is new technologies. There's discussion as to whether folks' cell phones could be used, and there are strong arguments for and against that. The for argument is they're cheap and everyone's got one. The against argument is people are going to find a way to not pay. Probably true in both cases, but there's a lot of these options that can be examined. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and pause there. Hopefully you have some questions. I know there was actually some issues I didn't touch on, but I tried to provide an overall overview, and happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation. So I sit in on the Transportation Committee for MAC quite a bit, and I've heard from a lot of our commissioners up north that they are concerned about, tourists coming from other states. How are we going to handle that? And also the rental car issue. So what are some of the solutions that other states have come up with to address those concerns?
Sure. So in terms of the tourist issue, other states have looked at coordination among the states, perhaps through the DMVs, perhaps organizations. A lot of the states that have tolling, such as in the Northeast, have Easy Pass, where you have one account in one state, and it's handled seamlessly as a back office type transaction, and it would probably be something along those lines. I will say states are going to adopt mileage-based user fees at different intervals. So one challenge is going to be, okay, I drive on Michigan roads, I drive on Wisconsin roads. So if Michigan has one before Wisconsin, how does that work? And it would be, you would just be charged what you're driving on Michigan roads, and in Wisconsin you would still be paying the fuel tax, and when Wisconsin decides to make the transition, then you would be paying, a mileage-based user fee in both. So there would be some transition, I don't want to say challenges, but some transition things to work for. But I think in tolling and the DMVs have shown a model where that can be successful for multi-state.
You mentioned collection costs are pretty high compared to the fuel tax. Can you talk a little bit more about what goes into those collection costs and what's driving that increased fee?
Sure. So the fuel tax, because it's collected by a very limited number of distributors, and it's relatively cheap to make that collection cost. It's very cheap. Among all programs, transportation and not transportation, if you get rid of evasion, you're probably looking at 1%. But you've got some evasion you have to take into account, people using agricultural fuel in their regular vehicles and whatever, so it looks more like 3 to 4%. With the mileage-based user fee, you have either the state or an account manager that has to actually do that. And a lot of these early contracts have been structured so that there was a per account charge. So every driver, for example, there was a certain fraction of a cent that the account manager would get, which was done basically when that was sort of a monopoly, but is not a great system as you're trying to scale. And the other thing is that just that type of collection is going to be more expensive than the fuel tax because you've got to collect it from everyone as opposed to just a limited number of places. So I think the solution there, obviously I mentioned the cell phone could be one solution. I think other solutions could be more integrative systems through DMV, more account managers. Right now we've only got 2 or 3. As there's more demand, there's going to be more folks who want to get into this. There's, early on, if there's not a market, it's hard to get folks who are willing to do it. So it's a challenge, but I think it's a challenge that can be met overnight. I will say I don't think a mileage-based user fee will ever be as cheap to collect as the fuel tax. I think we can get it down to close to 5%, I'd like to say maybe, which is not 3%, but nothing is going to be as cheap to collect as the fuel tax. So.
You had mentioned that the GPSs were a one-way reporting system, so it would tell how many miles I went, but not where I went. But what about, how's that going to work when I'm out of state? How does it know when I'm out of state?
So there's a couple of different ways. One is actually a matter of just switching the system off when you're out of state. Another option would be there's some that are GPS enabled and there are some that are not GPS enabled, and there's odometer readings as well. So it's a choice, and it's a matter of whether that out of state has a mileage-based user fee program. Obviously, if they did, it might be helpful to have those devices. If it didn't, it wouldn't. So some of it is going to be up to the driver and up to the system.
Hi. Thank you for your presentation. I have car insurance with State Farm, and they have this little gadget you put up on your windshield. Would that kind of be a solution? I mean, that's removable and tracks different things, braking and all that sort of thing. But is that any kind of solution that might work here?
Yeah, it's interesting you bring that up because those do use a very similar technology, and they also know. They collect data that we would not recommend you collect, like how you're driving, how hard you're braking, how fast you're going around your corners, and then use it to set rates, which they say they don't, but some of them do. It could be an option. It could be a lower cost option. I think some people are going to be comfortable with that. There can be some value added services in terms of health of the vehicle that get caught in there, that get included in there. I would also say that vehicles, if you have a vehicle that's been built in the last 5 years, it already has this technology built in. But the vehicle manufacturers, for very understandable reasons, don't want to be the one collecting money from you because they think that you're not going to like them if you see the bill from them, even though you might see the bill for their connected vehicle system. So, okay. So that's also an option if we can get over that hurdle. Right now, the automakers are not interested in that option. So yeah, there are some high-tech options if we can get there politically.
So the formula for dividing up the gas tax right now is pretty complicated. So what do you foresee for a formula for dividing up this money? And is the downstate going to get more than the out-of-state areas?
Oh, that's a dangerous question. I'm not that silly to answer that question. with all of these, we've proposed not just in terms of revenue neutral, but also in terms of formula neutral. Okay, because I don't want to get into a fight over who should get more, who shouldn't get more. That's a good discussion that's important to have, but the challenge with that is, you get folks who are unhappy and then they sink the whole idea because, well, I have to pay more than I had under the old one, and I'm not going to do that, and that's a political loser for me. So, yeah, we're not touching that one, but that's a good discussion to have.
You mentioned odometer readings. Anyone using that, and if so, how?
Yeah, so many of the states, well, some of the states, still have annual inspections. And when they have an annual inspection, you have an odometer, you do the odometer reading then. There is also some states that do odometer readings when folks bring their vehicle in for maintenance. Because most people, unless they repair it themselves, bring their vehicle in for maintenance at some point in time. And I will say, we get enamored of, GPS-based devices and what they can do and their, ability to be used in different ways. Odometer readings are simple. Odometer readings are cheap to collect, especially if you've got someone doing it. They just don't have all the advantages. But there's nothing wrong with an odometer reading. And every state that has a mileage-based user fee, I want to make sure I say that correctly, yes, all 5 states that have a permanent program do offer an odometer reading as an option.
Thanks, Farouk, for the presentation. I was thinking more broadly on transportation funding. I know you've mentioned this would be, in your mind, revenue neutral. Do you have any ideas for, addressing transportation limited funds that we see now, since if we do this revenue neutral, how could we increase our funding and address our needs in other ways? I'm curious if you have any ideas there.
Sure. And I will also say, although he's not taking credit, Ron Davis, who just asked that question in the back, has done a lot of tolling work in Michigan. So if you're interested in interstate tolling, I don't think I'm exaggerating to see he's kind of the brainchild behind a lot of that work. So one of the things that we're looking for a mileage-based user fee is it would be focused on non-freeways, non-limited access highways, not I-94, not I-75, not US 131. For those, we would be looking at tolling, and we would be looking at tolling at a rate that is probably set a little bit higher than the current gas taxes, and here's the reason why. Those roads are used more heavily by trucks. People go faster. They have higher use. They're worn out much more quickly. And so charging the equivalent rate for your local neighborhood street as for a major freeway does not make sense. And that's what we do today. That's what we do today. And so in effect, everybody who's driving on their local neighborhood streets and on county roads is subsidizing freeways right now. So by charging a higher rate there, you would then not need to subsidize those freeways, which means you would have more money for the county roads and more money for local streets. And it's a pretty powerful argument. It's such a powerful argument that when Republicans were in charge of the legislature a few years ago, and I was talking to them about this, that was a very convincing argument for folks who generally don't want to increase, don't want tolls, don't want any new taxes, and they're there, wait a minute, we have these roads subsidizing what? Why are we subsidizing out-of-state truckers? So, yeah, it's a good question. It definitely could be part of the revenue, solution, and obviously you don't need me to tell you Michigan roadways are not in great shape. I am fortunate, as I mentioned, to go to many different states. The roadways in this state are not great.
We talked a lot about individual states looking at this. Is the federal government looking at this at all, to kind of piggyback off what Brian said and shutting something off and turning it on as you go in and out of state? Is there a federal look at this?
Yes, that is a great question. You all are asking great questions, by the way. This is why I like to leave time for it. So the federal government is in the process of conducting a pilot. They were mandated by a federal surface transportation reauthorization bill, which we have every 5 to 6 years, to do a pilot. And they are, as they can be, rather slow and deliberate. So they right now are taking nominations for an advisory committee that is going to give advice on how to have this pilot. And they are going to look at some of the interstate issues, and I don't necessarily mean interstate highways, I mean between states, throughout the country type of issues. And they will also be looking for participants, but they're not going to be looking for as much local and county levels. But because we do want to have a coordinated system, and because obviously there are many different states throughout this country, having a federal pilot program is important. And I think it will, you know, in terms of cross-state cooperation, and in terms of new technologies, it could give us a lot of good information. It's just, as with everything the federal government does, is not going to happen quickly.
As a follow-up question to Ron's question on frequency, use, and cost, and that, the roads that are under the most stress because of speed and size of vehicles and that, how many other states, or what other states in the different pilot studies, whatever, are looking at different rates based upon whether it's a semi-truck versus a commercial vehicle versus a residential vehicle, or is it all being lumped into one singular fee per mile charge?
Sure. So the states are looking at it in a research perspective. There was I believe it was a simulation in the Eastern Transportation Coalition states with the trucking community that looked at them paying a rate that was about 4 times higher, and that was a real actual pilot. In terms of actually charging different rates on different roads, that's also more in the study phase than in the actual phase. I mean, there's some political hurdles. Some of it is we want to get a program implemented, and this is going to make it more complicated. Some of it is pushback from certain interest groups, as you can imagine. So I would say more research with limited actual pilots in terms of those issues.
Any other questions? Do we have, oh, Richard, I'll go.
Okay, I have a question here about this mileage-based. Just to give you an idea, I lived half of my life in Wayne County and Macomb County. So I went through the gas crisis of '75, where we were only allowed to get 10 gallons of gas. So I'm trying to figure out this mileage-based, but I'd like to know more details that the common person would understand. Because I know when I lived in Detroit through that gas crisis, I could fill my car up and go all month, drive back and forth. I couldn't do that for 1 day in rural America. So I can't see how this is going to work out. I hope you guys got the details for that, you know, because it definitely not worked by the standards of '75.
Well, I guess I would say that the overall gas tax in Michigan is a tiny fraction of the overall price you're paying. So the amount that you would not be paying would be, I'm not going to say it's not significant, but it's not really going to move the needle on the different prices. Whereas the difference in the mileage-based user fee between the urban areas and the rural areas, you know, I think that is probably more significant. So I think it's the more rural areas that are going to be the ones benefiting, because those folks are actually, there's a bigger difference there in terms of what they're saving than versus what urban and suburban residents would be paying more if you look at the numbers.
Well, I'm working to try to get one road done, a 1 mile section in my community. It goes to a business. 53 years they have waited this road to get done. I finally got a road commissioner that's sitting out there now. He's even designed everything on the road, but now I can't get the township to pay their share. Is that common around the state of Michigan?
Well, I don't know that I'm qualified to speak on that. I think that's a political conversation maybe with the township as opposed to what we can do.
Well, I already did, you know, and I've got the Attorney General looking at it right now. But these are questions that everyone should be asking. So I'll let you go.
I'm trying to help you with that too, Richard. I have one last question. I'm sure in all of your research you've encountered experts from the trucking industry. Where are they at on this whole concept?
They are skeptical. How long do you have? It's a complicated question because there's a number of things going on. First of all, one of the reasons why the trucking industry likes the gas tax is because they can pass it on to their customers. One of the reasons why they don't like tolling is because they can't. Of course, they don't like the fact that the rates are higher for tolling than gas taxes, but if they can pass it along, not so much of a difference. So any mileage-based user fee would have to be designed so it can be passed on, just like the gas taxes, right? Otherwise, they're going to have an interest in opposing it. And that's one set of conversations. Another challenge for them is they want to make sure it's easy. And they actually right now have a way of collecting fuel taxes through IFTA that basically is, or a way of tolling through IFTA that's a relatively simple way of doing it. And we would want to do mileage-based user fees that way. And then there's the third aspect, which is the harder aspect, which is you don't appreciate us, you just want us to pay more, you're socking us with the price, and we have all these regulations, and it's like, well, it's not us. None of that stuff, well, I'll leave the regulations, none of the other complaints are true. We do appreciate the trucking industry. They are important to the economy. We all saw that during COVID, but they do wear out the roads. It's just a number. It'd be impossible to even come up with a number how much more than cars, and so it's a conversation. But one of the ways to get their support is to include them in a pilot, and it makes sense for us. Or I should say, I don't say us, it makes sense for people who like the pilot idea, it makes sense for people who don't like the pilot idea, because they see a pilot as something that might be coming. They want to get their viewpoint in to make sure it's as good for them as possible. We see a pilot, or I see a pilot, as something that is promising, and I want to make sure that I've got all my potential stakeholders, including the folks who could be opposed, at the table. That's why you might want rural folks you think are opposed. You might want anti-tax folks. You might want privacy folks. Anyone who you think is going to be more likely to be opposed to this idea, really important to overrepresent them to, in most cases, change their minds, but if not, just to bring them to the table and see what can be worked out.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.